This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by This Is Not Church podcast and the letter F.
And you. If you've made it this far, my name is Nat Turney, my brother John Turney, and I co-host This Is Not Church, the podcast. And this is sadly the level of discourse that you can expect to find if you tune in every Monday when we drop new episodes. Wherever you stream podcasts, you can find us. Remember, this is not church. And to that, John says,
Peace.
Well, howdy everyone, and welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. Brian, my dear friend, how are you?
I'm wonderful. I'm wonderful on this winter's morning in Melbourne.
I know, it's so cold.
Not Melbourne, Florida for listeners. Melbourne,
no,
Australia.
that often comes up, doesn't it, when you try and type Melbourne into some sort of geo-linked app. It'll actually say Melbourne, Florida, and it's like, no, didn't even know it was there.
Yeah, no, I wish I was in Melbourne, Florida right now. That would be amazing. And we could hang out with Sharon, our dear friend from Feed a Clay podcast, because she's in Florida.
You could, and all the other Trump voters. It would be awesome.
It'd be good. And I'm sure in today's chat, Trump may come up. And if we talk about today's chat, first, I'll introduce our guest, and that's Cait West. And Cait lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And do you remember Grand Rapids? Wasn't that like Zondervan Bible?
Yeah, it was one of those Baker Book House or one of those publishing houses or whatever. Grand Rapids, Michigan, that's right. Maybe you'd open up your NIV study Bible and it was the holiest city in the US.
I think so, because as soon as I looked at Cait's bio, I went, oh, wow, that's the heartland. But Cait is an advocate and a survivor of the Christian Patriarchy movement. She serves on the editorial board for Tears of Eden, a nonprofit providing resources for survivors of spiritual abuse, and also co-hosts the podcast Survivors Discuss with our very good friend Claire McIver. But what has brought Cait to us today is Cait's book Rift, a memoir of breaking away from the Christian Patriarchy, is one that tells a harrowing story, but also I think it highlights hope for those who can break free from high control environments. Cait West, welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
Hello, and thank you for having me on today.
Oh, you're more than welcome. And one thing we ask our guests, and I think this is a foregone conclusion, but we're going to do it anyway. Were you a teenage fundamentalist?
Very much so, although I don't remember ever using that term to describe myself as a teenager.
Oh, no, we wouldn't have either. We would never have described ourselves as teenage fundamentalists, but we totally were.
Exactly.
Look, and I think as we get into your story, we're going to hear just how much of a teenage fundamentalist you were. And that high control environment, I think that many of us experienced, and many of our listeners, yours was turbocharged. Like it was some hardcore stuff. And when I was reading it, I was just going Handmaid's Tale, totally Handmaid's Tale. Like it was quite frightening, the level of control and just how incredibly browbeaten you were, I guess, as a person. And so I'm really looking forward to unpacking with you, how the hell do you move on from that? And how do you actually carve out a life that is full of, hope, love and light? Because there was a lot of darkness in those days. So for those who haven't read your book, though, or familiar with your story, can you give us a bit of an overview, just a few minutes, of what it was like growing up as Cait West? What did that look like?
Sure. And it's so interesting and validating when people say that I have a difficult story, because for me, it was so normal. I didn't know much different. And so now looking back, a lot of things make more sense now that I have language for it. But at the time, it was just the way my life was. I was baptized into a conservative Presbyterian church in Delaware in the U.S. Grew up on the conservative side of evangelicalism, but I would have called it a very typical church for that time and place. And then the older I got, the further my family became radicalized into more fundamentalist beliefs. So for instance, my older siblings went to public school, and then my parents pulled them out and put them into Christian school. And then by the time I was old enough, they decided to put me in homeschool, or just keep me home and homeschool me. And so even with that, you can see how they were shifting to be more and more isolated and more inside that evangelical bubble. And then a few years later, we moved to Colorado and became more involved in the Christian patriarchy movement, which is based on this ideology that men are in charge. They're the ones who lead all aspects of life, and women are the helpers, and they serve the men, whether that's their husbands or fathers. And being a girl in that movement, I was told I would never have a job. I would never go to college. I would become married as soon as possible, as soon as God brought a husband, and then have many children. And so if you're familiar with the Duggar family or Quiverful, it's the same world. And so that's how I grew up as a teenage fundamentalist, in that kind of world, more and more isolated the older I got.
I think there was, throughout your book, there were so many instances where your life was controlled to the nth degree, like who you could see, when you could see them. Chaperoning was a very real thing, almost like a bodyguard that had a shadow over your life all the time. Did it feel like it was normal for you, or were you at the time thinking, oh my God, I just feel so incredibly isolated by this, and I feel looked at and monitored all the time? Or was it just a normal thing for you?
It was pretty normal. I mean, by the time I was a teenager, I didn't see many people outside of my family. We lived in the mountains in Colorado, and we did a couple homeschooling things with other homeschool families, but mostly the only time I saw people was at our very patriarchal church on Sundays. And so everyone I interacted with was in that same mindset. But on the other side of that, most of my days I was being homeschooled, or really teaching myself from the books I was given. And it was very lonely. And I remember feeling very alone and sad. I think I went through depression, but that was not a word we would have used. And I didn't understand. I thought something was wrong with me because I couldn't be happy in this world that I was supposed to be happy in.
What about media? Television, movies, music, magazines, internet. Were you exposed to that, or was that very tightly controlled too?
It's very controlled, but it's very interesting because my mother loves movies. And so we did have a lot of movies around, but very much, dependent on what my dad allowed us to watch. And sometimes that shifted, which I think is pretty common in his kind of personality, where the rules shift. Sometimes you can watch Disney movies, sometimes you can't. And so I did have a lot of movies I could watch, but we didn't have the internet for a while when I was younger. And then I didn't have my own computer until I was over 18. So I didn't have access to outside information on my own until I was an adult. And even then, I was still self-policing because I was well trained not to look outside of the information I was given.
So the movies and things that you would see, did that rub up against what you were being taught, or was that also very controlled? Where we're not going to watch Father of the Bride because, she talks back to him. How did that all work for you?
That's a funny example because my dad loved that movie, which is so interesting. But he would say she's a rebellious daughter, and the father of that movie is the true hero, and the feminists are ruining his life. So it was always interpreted in his perspective. So that's kind of an interesting example. But yeah, I mean, most of the movies were very mild. We weren't allowed to watch anything with any sexual content in it, but something like The Patriot was allowed, even though there was a lot of violence, because my dad liked those kinds of stories. So really it just revolved around what my dad liked.
And who was influencing your family? Were there any big names from the Christian scene, or was it more, I don't know, offbeat even for the Christian world?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in the early years was James Dobson. And then my father became more conservative and James Dobson became too liberal, which is an interesting point of view. And then we became more influenced by organizations like Vision Forum, which was influenced by Bill Gothard's IBLP. Vision Forum was headed by Doug Phillips, and the pastor of our church was named Kevin Swanson, and he's a well-known fundamentalist preacher here in the U.S., very political at times. And so he was my pastor for about 6 years.
It's really interesting because Troy and I reflect often that we definitely were in a patriarchal movement, but there was freedom within that. You weren't necessarily as monitored or as judged as what you've experienced and you've explained. Even in, the way that Troy and I, with our first marriages, we conducted ourselves like it was, partnership. Whereas mine was, I very much took on that. I guess that I was the leader of the house and all that sort of stuff, but I was so uncomfortable with it because it rubbed up against who I was as a person. But there wasn't a church saying you have to do that. There was still a freedom within it. However, I think the messaging quite often from the pulpit and definitely from the leadership was a man needs to lead. And you would have all these meetings and mini conferences. I think iron sharpens iron was one of them, where you would get all the guys together and go, man up, you've got to lead the house, you've got to actually step up. Without you, your women and children will be lost sheep and you've got to guide them. But there wasn't a forcing of you to have to buy into that necessarily, but there was a lot of subliminal messages, if you like.
And subtle pressures, you know what I mean? It was there and it was taught openly, but I think there's a lot of peer pressure too. There's a lot of peer pressure on us to be that way. But if you didn't, you weren't going to be kicked out of the church or, not made a deacon or something like that.
It's still really insidious, I think, even when it's not as overt as it was in my case. I think it still can be really damaging, that kind of patriarchal outlook. Especially, I always say patriarchy harms everyone, because if you don't fit in that tiny little box of what your gender should be, then you don't fit into that community, right? And so I knew a lot of boys and men who didn't fit in that rigid definition of what a man should be. And they struggled with that, just trying to be themselves.
I completely agree. It puts a lot of pressure on men. And there's a very small percentage of men which really thrive off that alpha male, patriarchal type framework. And I agree. And that's the bit that I struggled with. It was like, that wasn't me. But then I was told I had to be that. I was told that I had to be someone who asserted more control and put more boundaries, because I knew biblically, I needed to hold on to those principles, that I was the guiding light. When you look at patriarchal, I mean, you explore the Christian patriarchy, as that defining framework or culture that you grew up under. But how does that differ from patriarchy in general? And how does that play out? I mean, you've talked about the insidiousness of patriarchal within society and even in a less fundamentalist environment. But how does that differ from the movement that you grew up and were influenced under?
I'm not sure there is too much of a difference. When I left, I moved to Michigan, which is where I live now. And as you mentioned, Grand Rapids is a Christian publishing hub, or at least, it's kind of not as powerful it used to be. Now Nashville is the center. But I thought I was leaving patriarchy behind because that's all I knew. And I was told the outside world was so dangerous and they didn't follow this belief system. And then I ended up here and found patriarchy everywhere. I found it in the way my landlord treated me and how my employers treated me and how hard it was to go through school and the different reactions I got from being a woman in school. So it was, kind of a disappointment to realize patriarchy is everywhere. But also I think Christian patriarchy has this extra layer of divine approval on it, which can make it even more traumatic, I think, because you're telling people you have to follow this in order to follow God, or you're going to hell forever, or God doesn't love you. And so you have to conform to this system to be part of God's kingdom. And so that's all part of how spiritual abuse works. I think patriarchy is abusive in general, and then Christian patriarchy takes it into a religious space, which can be even more powerful and I think more damaging.
How did you wake up to it? What were some of those defining moments when you were still young, you're still at home, that eventually led you to say, I want to walk away from all this?
I think I had little sparks of moments growing up of individuality that I knew didn't fit into this world. So my heroes when I was younger was like Queen Elizabeth I, and how she was this monarch as a woman who didn't have a marriage. And I just thought that was really cool. But I couldn't talk about that with other people because that didn't fit into our world. And as I got older, I repressed more of my desires. So I wanted to go to college. I didn't talk about that. And I was always rubbing against those rules and not knowing the language I needed to speak up for myself. And instead, I blamed myself and internalized it and just conformed more. And it wasn't until I got older, graduated from homeschool, and realized I didn't have anything in my life that was very meaningful. I was just waiting to get married, and I was shipped out to different families to homeschool their kids and be a nanny and do all these things for like $3 an hour, things like that. Realizing I had no control over my life. And then had my first courtship, which in my mind was now I get to be an adult. If I get married to this person, I get to make my own choices, which again was very naive in that world. That wouldn't have been the case. Anyways, my dad ended the courtship after, I think, 8 months. I talk about that in my book. There was different reasons for that. But I remember just being so heartbroken and feeling so sad about this because I had imagined that I was going to get married and be happy with this person. And my dad said, you have no choice. This is what's happening. And that was one of those pivotal moments when I just knew the truth that wasn't true, that God would hate me for feeling love for this other person, because my dad follows this belief of emotional purity. So not only is there sexual purity in courtship, there's emotional purity. And so because I had feelings, I was being sinful, and my dad was telling me to repent for that. And that I just knew in my core that wasn't true. And that was one of those moments where I started shifting over that mental barrier that something's not right here. And I always tell that story because I was 21 at that time and I was 25 when I left. And it took me a long time to figure out how to leave after that moment. But that was like a really key day. I remember it so vividly and thinking, I'll never let this happen to me again.
I have to say, the fact that you call it a courtship as well stood out to me, because that's not a word that most people would use in society today. And even some of us that were in church, to say courtship. So that even reflects, I don't know, the conservativeness of it all, the fact that, you were in a courtship. Is that how, was it really, really strongly defined? Like, okay, now the courtship begins, now the courtship ends.
Yes. Yeah. So there was no dating, and courtship was a process that was led by your father. I mean, it's not, they would say it's not an arranged marriage, that I would have the power to say yes or no to the relationship and then yes or no to getting married to the person. But there aren't very many options for girls in this world, so it's not really much of a choice. But anyway, a courtship, my dad followed this courtship guide, and it was titled A Pathway to Christian Marriage, which now I'm looking back and I'm like, that's the cultiest title you could make a pamphlet out of. And it taught you very detailed how to have a biblical courtship based on Abraham and Isaac and how the patriarchs of the Old Testament did it. And that was where this concept came from. And, very cherry-picked verses of what they wanted to happen, but it was always father-controlled. Father was the center of everything. And that's where the chaperones come in. You could never be alone together. You couldn't have emotions until you became betrothed, which is the word that we used. We weren't allowed to use the word engaged. Once you're betrothed, you could have feelings, but you still couldn't have any physical touch until your wedding day, which is when you would have your first kiss. So it was very rigid. Every father in this movement tended to have different variations of this. But in my church, my dad was considered the courtship expert. And so he would teach people how to do this method. And so I was supposed to be, the model daughter and follow those rules perfectly, which clearly didn't happen.
Well, lucky you. Lucky you that your father was the courtship expert. That just sounds absolutely terrible. I mean, I'm thinking, Brian, about some of the families that we knew who seemed to adhere to some of this, at least. Like, I was dating a girl at one stage and her parents broke us up, and we were in our 20s, and she had no say. In fairness to her, I think that's what she wanted anyway. But it did go on. But it was seen as a little bit more extreme in the worlds that we were in.
I'm just thinking of marrying someone you haven't even kissed. And we've all had those drunken pashes with somebody where their tongue bumps around your mouth like a wet sock. And can you imagine if that's what you're stuck with for life? Someone that doesn't even know how to kiss properly, passionately. I mean, God, it's all those sort of things. They're all things you test out in a relationship before you commit to anything long term. I just can't even fucking imagine.
Yeah,
that.
but Satan is your Lord, Brian. So, I mean, you would say that, right?
I would say that. And if that's the case, I'm happy for him to be my Lord rather than having everything arranged for me. That it's just frightening stuff, that control. And I guess one thing that really came out in your book as well was that really significant focus around purity, and you also being the property of someone else, not having agency over your own life and your own body. And if in this case, obviously, it was your dad that was you were the property of his. How'd you view your place in the world when that was the case? That purpose, that sense of self, your aspirations that you have, or your dreams, or didn't you have any as a result?
I definitely had dreams. I just didn't talk about them. And I blamed myself. So I had this dream of playing the piano professionally and going to a piano competition and doing this as a career. But that was just completely off limits. And so I had to only use piano for church, right? Or for my own personal entertainment at home. And it was very limiting, but at least I could still play the piano, right? So it's kind of a halfway compromise you talk yourself into. I was told that my place was to get married, to raise a home, a godly family, homeschool my children, be that kind of biblical woman, right? The Proverbs 31 woman, and that would make God happy and that would bring God's kingdom on earth. And I was part of this idea. We called it the Joshua generation. I think Mike Ferris started that term with the HSLDA here about, I don't know if you've talked about HSLDA on your podcast before, but it's a homeschool organization for parental rights. And yeah, so the Joshua generation was my age, my peers, and we were told we were going to grow up and be the generation that would take over the country for God, right? So it was very dominionist type of theology. And the story comes from Moses in the desert and how the people of Israel, the people coming out of Egypt couldn't get into Israel. And then their next generation, the generation of Joshua, were the ones who were going to go into the promised land. And so that's why we were called that. So it's a lot of pressure as kids to be told, your generation is going to take over the country and bring God's kingdom. There's a lot of pressure there, but also it makes you feel like you belong, like you're special, you're called to something bigger than yourself. And so I tried to fit into that, but at the same time, I had a lot of individual dreams and desires that I was trying so hard to repress, which is why I think I was depressed a lot, because I had that cognitive dissonance all the time.
So, Cait, one of the things we're trying to do this season is we're trying to look to people that have moved on. We're trying to tell those stories of people that have come from situations like yours and situations like we were in and have moved forward. So tell us, how did you start to break free of this? I know that you did, you mentioned that you went to Michigan, etc. But more practically, what did that look like for you? And tell us about your journey moving forward.
Sure. So the first thing was that mental barrier of imagining that I could have a different kind of life And that was a scary thought. I remember just wondering, like, what would it be like if I left? And what would it be like if I went to college? And just imagining that helped me eventually leave. But it took a long time to get the practical resources I needed. So for me, that was finding loopholes, right? And so I was allowed to teach piano lessons because I wouldn't have a boss. My dad would be my boss. So I was allowed to do that. And my dad let me keep the money from that, which doesn't always happen with stay-at-home daughters. So I had some money. I saved that up. And around the same time that I started this other relationship, turns out he's the pastor's son, which was kind of hilarious. But my father didn't approve of our relationship. And so we had this kind of secret relationship. At the same time, I was trying to save up money. And we just decided to move out and leave together. And it was quite the dramatic turn of events. Ended up in Michigan, no money left, and didn't know how to get a job. But really, it was just so exciting to get out of a situation where I was so trapped. And so for me, it had to start with knowing in my heart that I needed something different and then finding a way to follow that. And it's interesting. I was talking to a therapist, not my therapist, but another person who read the book recently. And she said it was interesting how emotions come to play in my story because those emotions got me in trouble in my first courtship. But they also led me to realize that something was wrong. And once I started following those, even though I was taught your heart is deceitful, once I started following my emotions and my intuition, that's what led me to actually get out, was actually listening to those signals my body was telling me. So I think that's an interesting, view of what happened.
Cait, you say that you got out. So was there a break? I mean, your book is called Rift.
Yeah. Was
there a break with your family? Did you feel like you'd escaped? Was there a shunning? What happened?
It's the part about the rift that it's kind of a misnomer because in one sense, there's a before and an after. And in another sense, it's never quite as clean cut as that. And so my leaving didn't take place in one day. I was in this continual fight with my father when I was trying to get out and trying to figure out a way to leave. I was asserting myself, I was speaking up for myself, and he was calling me names. He was calling me a feminist and saying how sinful I was. And it was just really escalating to the point. I write about this one scene in the book where I was so scared of my dad. I ran out of the house. I was 24 years old. I ran up the street. Just my body wanted to get away. And he chased after me and brought me home. I was so on edge constantly. My nervous system was just like, on the verge of crisis. I was in crisis. That went on for months because I was trying to leave. My dad was trying to keep me back. And there was, he was threatening me with different things. And I knew from watching what had happened before that my dad would very easily cut me off because my older brother had left when he was 17. He didn't want any part of the church, and we lost contact with him for a few years. And so I knew that could happen to me. I was scared to lose my family, but at some point it became I need to leave. So I bought a plane ticket. I told my dad I'm leaving. And at that point, he barely said anything. It was all this anger and fighting that was happening. And then the moment where I said I got the ticket, it was like silence. It was so anticlimactic, and it felt like he was giving up. But he just went back to work. It's like he didn't care anymore about me or how I was feeling. It was all about the control. And so I got that plane ticket. I left, and I still had contact with my dad for a few years after that. But he never wanted to talk about what had happened until I started talking about this online. And that's when he decided to stop our relationship. There's different kinds of rifts in my life. There was a rift with my father, which took place over several years. There was a rift between me being in this movement and me leaving. That was like that one day I got on the plane and I ended up in another state. And that was my new life. But also this rift in myself of feeling like I was broken and I couldn't be a whole person until I left and could piece back together who I am. That's what I'm trying to get at with this rift of escape. It's not just leaving a situation, because a lot of it's in your mind and in your body, and trying to recover from that.
What's happening with your mum during all of this? Obviously, your mum is certainly, I would assume, under the control of your father as well, but she's also a mum, and she's seeing the pain of her daughter. She's seeing the pain of her children in general being caught up in this. What's happening with your mum and your relationship with her?
You know, it's really complicated for her, and I'm always trying to understand why she did certain things. When I started talking for myself and trying to leave, she made it clear to me that she supported me. And I remember I wanted this one book about stay-at-home daughters that was about someone who had left. And she helped me buy an ebook of that I could read in secret. She did help me in certain ways that my father wouldn't know about. And I felt like she was trying to be the buffer between us. And so I'll always appreciate that. I think she was in a difficult place, trying to appease my dad, trying to keep us safe, getting a lot of that abuse herself. And when I left, I knew that she supported it and that she wanted me to be happy. And that has always meant a lot. And she's always said, I'm never going to lose my relationship with you, no matter what happens. And so even though she's still with my dad, I do have contact with her. And it's been a lot to navigate. How do you do that when you have no contact with one parent and then limited contact with the other, and they live in the same place? We figured it out, and something that works for us. And she even came to visit me this year for the first time in over a decade. And there was something really healing about that. I don't know where it's going to go now, but I've seen my mother become more assertive and more, using her voice in recent years. And so I've always appreciated her support, even though at the same time, she's also apologized for her part in all of this.
Cait, you talked about moving to Michigan and starting a new life. Were there things that you consciously decided, I'm going to do this? I'm going to go here. I'm going to watch this movie, whatever. Were there things that you consciously said, yeah, this is what I'm going to do? And at the same time, what were the things that you found yourself stepping into that you would never have thought you were going to go there, even though you're walking away?
So I think, at first I was like, let's throw all the rules out the window. And, very mild. I bought all of the Harry Potter books, used copies, because that's what I could afford, and just read them all, while I was trying to get a job, because I didn't have a job at first. I just read Harry Potter and I was like, these aren't that bad. Just that freedom to read whatever I wanted. And then it was right around the time when the TV show Girls was out on HBO. And I don't know if you've seen that, but for me, it was like this sex education I never had. Just watching the show about young women having their own lives in New York City. And I was just like enthralled by, what people could do when they're free. And so that was a really fun part of leaving, is exploring different kinds of books and movies. But the other part of your question, sorry, my mind just went blank.
That's okay. I was asking about, you made those decisions to I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But what sort of crept in? What did you find yourself doing that you weren't necessarily planning to do? And by the way, before you answer that, I just have to say, when you say I threw out all the rules, I thought you were going to really talk about the kind of stuff that I did when I threw out all the rules, which was, you threw out all the rules and read Harry Potter. I threw out all the rules and had to get sexual testing things done, right? But anyway.
Okay. Yeah. So, you have to understand, I also left and immediately got married to this person that I had a secret relationship with. So a lot of our time was spent trying to work and trying to save money and trying to just survive. There wasn't a lot of time or money to do anything but that. We moved into this little apartment and all we had was a cardboard box and a piano. a cardboard box for a table and then a piano to play music on. So we had nothing, and it was really just trying to figure out who we were. And also we were tied still to going to church. And even though I had left this restrictive movement, I felt still like I needed to follow certain religious things. Even though, I always struggled with being in a box. And so I guess maybe eventually just leaving the church altogether was something I didn't expect. Was just saying, I don't want any part of this, actually. I thought maybe I could leave my restrictive family and find a better church. But for me, it just didn't work out altogether.
So how did that go with, David in the book sounds like a very amazing human and someone who helped you navigate which is obviously such an incredibly tumultuous time in leaving. But David was the pastor's son as well. Mm-hmm. So you're now married to David. What did that look like where you're leaving church? Is that something David's done as well? Is that a place you've come to together? Or has that caused, dare I say, another rift?
So, yeah, it's been so interesting because he has always been so supportive of me being independent and making my own decisions. And he's always just been there to support me as I figure out, like before I left, he helped me get my first cell phone, right? So I had some level of independence in my communication. But then after we left, we both wanted to go to church, and we did for a while. And then I saw the problems a lot sooner than he did because, the way I grew up and being so familiar with how patriarchy works, I could see it. And the church we were going to was still there. They just didn't use the same terminology. So they would use like complementarianism instead of patriarchy. It's the same exact thing. And I started speaking up about that and rubbing against the edges and getting people at church upset with me. And he witnessed that. And obviously patriarchy doesn't affect him the same way, but he was listening to what I was saying and seeing how people were treating me. And so we both were on this journey of like, what is true and what's real. And then when 2020 happened, the pandemic started, we stopped going to church, and I never wanted to go back. And I think I was a little more quick to say that than he was, but he eventually came to the same conclusion. And now I think we're both around the same page. And that's only very recently of where we both feel like we don't want to be part of a church and we're happy with where we are. Being on the same page hasn't always happened, but we've always respected each other's process, right? Because there's no forcing someone to believe a certain way. And we've always cared about each other to not try to convert someone to a different belief system. It's just the respect in our own journeys. And somehow we ended up at the same place.
I think that's really important, that coming together with someone because you love them rather than coming together because that's the next step. And that's what happened with me. I found myself in a marriage that I shouldn't have been in, but that's because that was the next step. We were dating for this long. So the next step is to get engaged, and the next step is to get married, and then we're going to plant churches and, and all this kind of thing. And it really, I don't want to say tugs at my heartstrings. That's a cliche, but it's just nice to hear that some people actually get married for all the right reasons in spite of all the wrong reasons. And so it's nice that you guys are feeling that way. Let me ask you though about the book. Tell us why you decided to write the book, and tell us what were the challenges that you faced when you're starting to put all this down on paper.
So when I left, I knew I wanted to go to college and figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and part of that was really exciting. Part of that was really terrifying. How do you start from scratch? But I quickly became really interested in studying writing in college. And I've always loved writing. It's always been an escape for me. And I thought it'd be really cool if I could do that somehow as a living, and edit books, and write books. And so I went to school. I started studying fiction writing, and the program I was in required us to do 2 different genres. And so I'm terrified of poetry. So I picked nonfiction. I was studying fiction and nonfiction and started writing little bits of my story and realized the reactions of other people reading it they're very interesting because I had been trying to not tell anyone what had happened to me and just pretend I was like this normal person who never had anything bad happen to her. Once I started sharing little bits and seeing how people were like, that's really weird. Why were you doing that? Or why did you have a courtship? I realized my story was a lot bigger than I was trying to suppress it into being this tiny little backstory I didn't want to talk about. And I kept writing. And the more I wrote about it, the more I felt like I needed to get it out of my system because it had felt trapped inside of me for so long. And part of that is having PTSD and struggling with mental health and going through therapy at the same time and realizing part of this is my story I need to talk about it, or at least need to write it down and process what happened. And so it started as, a project for me. And then I became concerned seeing similar stories happening around me in churches and my community and friends and realizing it's not just about me. And so I wanted to start talking about this online. And that's when I realized there are so many people who have been abused, or especially spiritual abuse and religious trauma. And we're all kind of grasping for language to explain what had happened. There were very few, if any, stay-at-home daughters talking about this. And so I wanted to bring some awareness. And so that's where the seeds of this project started, was me trying to write my story, trying to reach out to other people who knew what I was talking about, and then wanting to make something creative out of it. I didn't want to just tell my story. I wanted to make something that felt artistic to me. And that's why a lot of the book is about geology and descriptions of the places I lived and me trying to figure out what the meaning of life is and how do we connect to each other as humans. So I wanted to be bigger than just me. And the roadblocks to that was the PTSD, because I saved all the hardest scenes to write to last. And I don't know if I did that consciously. I think it was just, I don't need to write this right now. I'll write this later. And then I knew I needed to write certain things. And it was very difficult to do that for my mental health because I wasn't taking good care of myself at the time. So it was definitely a struggle. But once I got through it, I felt like I had learned so much about myself, about how to get help, how to find a therapist, how to find a support network at the same time as writing this book. And so by the time I sold it and published it, I felt like I have learned so much about myself and about the world. And now it feels like I can let the book go and go do its thing in the world. And maybe other people can connect to it. And I can, in a way, move on from this story a little bit and maybe write some fiction again.
What is its thing in the world that you want it to do? For those who read it or are yet to read it, and I do encourage people to read it, what do you want it to do? What's its hope for you? And what would you advise people, I guess, who are in that place of sitting there, and your book may be the book that your mum helped you buy for somebody. It may be about that leaving. What do you say to those people?
It's just, my heart goes out because I know there's so many people like this. And I hope they feel seen and heard and validated, because that's something I needed as a little girl, is knowing that I mattered and that what happened to me mattered. And I want them to know that they have agency in their lives and that there are other ways to live. And it's just a matter of figuring that out. And there's a lot of people out here who can help you with that. And so I hope it just brings that kind of support, because I think stories can be magical in that way of helping people see themselves in new ways and see other people and make changes in their life that will lead them to be, healthier and happier, hopefully. And then secondarily, I hope that it helps people who might not be able to relate to this to understand like the broader context of Christian patriarchy and how influential it has been. And if they haven't experienced this, I can guarantee they know somebody who has, and helping create that empathy around this and hopefully spread more awareness of how damaging it can be and how there are ways that we can help people who are stuck in these high control religions.
Cait, you talked about leaving church. I hope you don't mind me asking this, but we are a deconstructing podcast. Where's your faith now? Do you have one? Do you still believe? And tell us a little bit about the journey, how that's changed. And I don't want to presuppose because I really don't know. If you did leave the faith, how is that impacting for you?
Yeah, well, I started this new group that I'd like to invite you to join. No, I'm just kidding. I was going to start a new cult. But no, I left church and then it felt like the things I had believed just fell away. It wasn't really a conscious choice. I had just studied so much and researched so much, and the theology stopped making sense to me. And so, I don't believe most of the things I had been taught about God and religion. I usually just say I'm pretty agnostic at this point. I feel open to things I don't understand. And I actually do enjoy reading other theology books sometimes. So liberation theology and books by Indigenous writers, womanist theology. I think it's fascinating to learn different ways to see the universe. And I'm mostly just leaning into that curiosity without any fear, and I think that's key for me is that need to feel so secure in some kind of certainty that I don't have anymore. And I'm not afraid to be in that place. So yeah, I feel pretty open and curious, and it makes me feel more alive, to be honest, instead of just constantly numbing out.
So what I'm hearing you say is you still feel secure. And I think that's something that people become fearful of leaving, because it's a security blanket. If I leave this, fuck, what have I got to hang on to? So it's so great to hear you say that you've left and you still feel secure and you feel comfortable in the not knowing, because I think the not knowing is such a privileged place you can sit. And Troy and I have been speaking about this in going, it's so freeing just being able to say, I actually don't know. And that doesn't matter that I don't know. And it's so liberating. So good on you for being able to get to that place.
Yeah. And, I think I'm not even sure I felt secure before, because I was in such an unsafe environment with this facade of protection where I was told I was secure, but I never really felt truly secure. I always felt afraid, like maybe God hadn't chosen me. And so there was always this fear that I wasn't a good enough Christian, or not going to follow the rules good enough, or have enough faith. And that was a really scary place to live for almost 30 years of my life. And now I don't have those fears. And so I feel like I'm learning a new definition of what security even is.
It's interesting, isn't it? The contradiction of, it's the faith that comes from God, and yet we feel guilty for not having enough faith. Or even listening to you then saying, what if God hasn't chosen me? As if somehow that's your responsibility. That's
right.
It's just double talk, isn't it? It just does our heads in, as we say here in Australia. What does your life look like now then? Okay, so you've moved on from this. You've made that clear. You're questioning your faith, etc. But practically, are you working? Are you involved in, I don't know, Lions Club, Rotary? Who is Cait now?
Yeah, my life is completely different. I have a job as a book editor, turns out. Going to college helped with that. And so I get to read books all day and work on other people's books. And then I published my own book this year, which has been exciting. And I've been able to travel around the US quite a bit, which has been really fun. I love traveling and seeing new places. And when I'm home, I love gardening and reading and watching documentaries. And yeah, I just feel like there's never enough time for all the things I want to do. And I feel so excited to be alive. At the same time, it's a very anxious time to be an American. But besides that, like, I just feel so privileged to be here and to be free from what I was in. I also feel like I'm in this transitional moment because now that the book is out, I've been working on this for years and I want to know what's next. I'd like to write more. I'd like to write some fiction next and not just focus on my own story, but maybe do something else for a change. And I'm excited about that prospect. Just need some time after this book tour is over.
I can imagine that you've got a lot on your plate, obviously, with that book tour and the promotions. So, best of luck in what you write next. But I do want to really encourage people to read your book. I loved the way that it was written. Like it was punctuated by, they weren't even chapters. I don't know if you can describe it, but you'd have a couple of pages which sort of broke it up in between the chapter and helped really contextualize the book. I found it really, it's the first book I've read that's sort of written like that. So was that your intention to write that, to help people sort of get it and for it to land, or did it just work out that way?
I think that's just, partly my writing style and the way my brain works. I really struggle to write a linear, like A to B to C story of my life. And I think that's just how traumatic memory works. It doesn't fit in your brain in a very linear way. And so it was a struggle to get the story on the page in a way that would make sense to other people. And having those other little pieces, like I have pieces about geology, and then I have pieces of explaining the books that I grew up with and the voices that were around me. And I have quotes and things like that. And I like the idea of quilting that all together to make this more of like a, like a quilt, I guess. Something that pieces all these different things into a bigger whole, and you can see the different layers. And I think that it lets people think for themselves through what's happening instead of just me telling them what happened. It gives it more of a texture, I think. And that's just the way I tend to write. Yeah.
Well, it landed really well because I felt like I knew you more deeply just through those one or two pages that would come about. So, yeah, well done on that. It was very creatively written, and it also helped. It was almost like a breather in between what it could be a really heavy chapter as well. It took you on a journey somewhere for a minute or two, and then you brought back into the chapter. So, well done.
Yeah, I like writing about nature because for me, nature is a grounding practice. Is being outside and being connected to the earth. It makes me feel more real and like I'm not just bound to the past. And so writing about nature in the book, I think I was doing that for myself, but hopefully other people too can find that sense of calm in between these, difficult moments.
Cait, our audience, we've got a large US audience, but we've got a large international audience as well. Why don't you tell us how we can find your book and also how we can connect with you? Have you got a blog? Have you got a website?
Yeah, so my book is called Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. And it should be available anywhere that you buy your books. And I'm pretty sure it can be bought internationally. I've heard people from Australia and, as far off as South Africa told me they've been able to get a copy. So I'm not sure how that works in each country, but it's definitely available. You can get it in hardcover, ebook, or audiobook. I read the audio, so you can also do it that way. My website is caitwest.com. I spell my first name Cait. And I have a Substack newsletter, and I'm on social media. And also, I want to shout out to Tears of Eden, which is the nonprofit I volunteer with. It's a great resource for, if any of this sounds familiar, we have a lot of resources for people who've been through spiritual abuse inside of evangelicalism, including a podcast and a support group, things like that. So tearsofeden.org. And you all can also find me on my podcast, Survivors Discuss, which I have with Claire Heath McIver and Sherry Smith. And we like to have panel discussions with people who are talking about high control religion. So a lot going on. You can probably find me anywhere just by Googling me. So yeah, I'd love to connect.
I'll make sure that I put all the details in our show notes. So
Thank you.
Those links are there if you want to just scroll down, folks.
And I can confirm you can buy it in Australia. So if you can buy it in Australia, you can probably buy it anywhere. And they're bundling your book, Cait, with another one called Loving, Living and Leaving the White Evangelical Church, The Ex-Vangelicals by Sarah McCammon. So look at that. They're bundling you up with people as well, but you can buy it separately.
I just want to say, Brian, by the way, and not want to make light, but if you can buy it in Australia, you can buy it anywhere. I don't think that's true, because I'm sensing you can't get this book in North Korea.
That might be the one place.
Where there's a will, there's a way. I believe that you could. So, Cait, thank you so much for the chat today. And I do want to say to people again, get the book. It really is a great book. And even for those who grew up within a patriarchal Christian movement, I think it will open your eyes as to the extremism that Cait grew up under. But also, I think just the hope. I love things that end with hope and a way forward. And your book ends with that. And certainly the story you've told us today shows people that you can break free from this, you can grow, and you can become an amazing human outside of that space. You don't have to actually take that identity forward. So thank you, Cait. Wishing you all the best for your next fiction book. Maybe we'll have you back on speaking about your fiction book, and maybe it'll have characters in there called Troy and Brian. Who knows? Such
a good idea. I'll take that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Cait. If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to join our listener community on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram, X, and Reddit. Check out our merch on Redbubble. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and all kinds of great ex-evangelical stuff that you can wear proudly. All proceeds go to building and promoting the podcast. We want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. Subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, early access to episodes, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and monthly bonus content. Again, all proceeds of this go to the running and promotion cost of the podcast. A special thanks to Ava, who manages our social strategy, and also to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group, and also to Bree, who puts out our monthly newsletter on Substack. All of our episodes are transcribed by Leanne to increase accessibility. The show is produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. The sound engineering for this episode was done by Jonathan O'Brien. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is available wherever you find your podcasts. Again, you can find all our links in our link tree in the show notes. Or why don't you pop across to our website at www.iwasateenagefundamentalist.com.